It was one of those nights where everything felt heavier than usual. The air, the quiet, even the darkness seemed thicker. I had been working as a patrol officer for almost 9 years at that point, and I had grown used to the strange rhythm of night shifts. The way the town changed after midnight, how the streets emptied, how sound traveled differently through the still air. You start to notice things that normal people never think about. A single porch light left on. The way dogs bark farther apart. The way you can hear your own boots scrape against the wet pavement when the rest of the world seems asleep. That night started like most others. It was just after 1:30 a.m., a Tuesday in late November. The temperature had dropped fast, and a low fog was rolling through the outskirts of town. I was driving through the industrial district, a place that used to be busy years ago when the factories still ran around the clock. Now, half the buildings were empty. Steel skeletons and busted windows, graffiti everywhere, and the constant sound of dripping water from broken pipes. Dispatch radioed in a welfare check. A woman had called saying she saw a man walking into one of the abandoned warehouses on Garfield Street around midnight and never saw him come back out. Normally, a call like that wouldn't seem urgent. People wandered into those places all the time to get out of the cold or find a quiet spot to sleep. But the caller mentioned something else. She said the man was limping, and he looked hurt, like he'd been in an accident. I drove over. The warehouse she was talking about was one I knew well, a big, crumbling brick building that used to store machine parts back in the day. The city had been trying to sell it for years, but nobody wanted it. It sat between two empty lots, with a narrow service road behind it that led to the old rail tracks. I parked by the curb, turned off my lights, and just listened for a minute. Nothing but the soft hum of the wind moving through broken windows. The front gate was unlocked. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges letting out a faint metal groan. My flashlight beam caught the shape of a few rusted barrels, some old pallets, and a half-collapsed loading dock. The ground was slick with mud and oil stains. I could see boot prints leading toward one of the side doors, fresh ones, deeper than mine. That told me someone had been there recently, probably within the last couple of hours. I followed the prints, my light steady, sweeping across the ground. The door had been pried open before. It hung crooked on one hinge. Inside, the air changed immediately. It was colder, and it smelled like mold and burnt rubber. The floor was covered in dust except where the boot prints cut through. The beam of my flashlight caught old machinery, torn insulation, and graffiti covering almost every wall. I followed the prints down a narrow hallway that led into the main part of the warehouse. The ceiling was high, and the roof had holes where the rain had been dripping for years, leaving black stains on the concrete. The sound of water echoed somewhere far off. I paused, listening again. There was no sign of movement, but I could feel something in that space, a sort of weight in the silence, like the air was holding its breath. I walked slowly, my boots crunching on bits of broken glass. The beam of light swept over a pile of old cardboard boxes, an overturned chair, and then something on the ground about 20 feet ahead. It was a jacket, dark-colored, soaked from the damp air, covered in dust. It looked recently dropped. Next to it was a small trail of blood. Not much, just a few drops, smeared like someone had brushed against something. I followed the marks carefully, tracing them through the middle of the floor toward the back of the warehouse where a staircase led down into the basement. The air coming from below was colder, and there was a faint smell of something sour and chemical, like cleaning fluid mixed with decay. The concrete steps were cracked, and my flashlight beam bounced off the walls as I went down, revealing old pipes and hanging wires. The deeper I went, the worse that smell became. It reminded me of a hospital mixed with something rotten. When I reached the bottom, the floor leveled out into a large open space that looked like it had once been used for storage. There were old shelves and scattered tools everywhere. The light from my flashlight landed on something at the far end of the room. A small table, a few chairs, and what looked like a sleeping bag. Someone had been living down there. There were empty food cans, a water jug, and a pile of newspapers stacked neatly in the corner. But what made my chest tighten was what I saw on the wall. There were photos, dozens of them, pinned up in uneven rows. Some were Polaroids, others printed on computer paper. They showed faces, Random people. Some of them were from around town. I recognized one man who ran a repair shop, another who worked security at the mall. None of them looked posed. Most looked like they were taken from a distance, through windows, across streets, at gas stations. I felt a chill crawl up my back. Whoever this person was, they had been watching people for a long time. I stepped closer, scanning the photos, and that's when I noticed something else. Near the bottom of the wall, there were 3 more pictures. These were different. They showed the same person, lying down, eyes closed, skin pale. It looked like a woman, maybe late 30s. Her face was bruised, and the background looked like a concrete floor, just like the one I was standing on. I crouched down, looking closer. The bottom edge of one photo had a date written on it in marker, just 4 days ago. I turned, shining my light around the basement. That's when I saw the tarp in the corner. It was folded over something large. The edges were dark and wet. My stomach tightened as I moved toward it. When I pulled the corner back, the smell hit me so hard I had to take a step back. It was her, the same woman from the photos. She was partially wrapped in plastic, and there were marks on her wrists and ankles. She hadn't been dead long. I stood there for a long second, my mind just blank, my heart pounding in my ears. I called it in, gave the address, and waited for backup. I stayed near the stairs, keeping my light on the body. The building was so quiet that every drip of water sounded sharp. But then I heard something else, a faint scrape like metal on concrete. It came from behind one of the shelves at the far end of the basement. My hand went to my weapon. I moved slowly toward the sound, every step careful. When I got close enough to the shelf, I shone my light through the gaps. Behind it was a small maintenance tunnel, just wide enough for a person to crawl through. I stepped closer, and the smell of damp air and rust hit me again. Then I saw movement, a shadow slipping farther down the tunnel. Someone was in there, moving away from me. I called for more units again, then stayed at the opening, watching the darkness. The tunnel led toward the rail line behind the warehouse, and by the time backup arrived, whoever it was had already disappeared. We searched for hours, but all we found were a few more personal items. Clothing, a backpack, a wallet that belonged to a man who had gone missing 2 months earlier. It took weeks for the investigation to piece together who it all belonged to. The man in the tunnel was identified later from prints we lifted off the food cans. He'd been living in abandoned places across the state for years, moving from one small town to another. His record showed minor theft, trespassing, and 1 old assault charge. What was worse was that he had been linked to several disappearances over the last decade. People who were never found. He was never caught. The case went cold after that. No new sightings, no new evidence. But every now and then, late at night, we'd get a report about someone seeing a man walking near the tracks, limping, carrying a flashlight, or standing still on the edge of the woods watching cars go by. Nothing ever confirmed, but enough to keep the story alive. Sometimes when I drive through that area, I still think about that basement. The smell, the cold air, the wall of photos, the way the air felt thick, as if someone had been there just seconds before I arrived. I think about the woman wrapped in plastic, about how many others might have ended up in places just like that, forgotten in some corner of an abandoned building. What stays with me most is the thought that if I had arrived even an hour earlier that night, I might have caught him. Maybe she could have been saved. Instead, I found the silence after everything was already done. That kind of silence doesn't go away. It follows you, sits with you, and sometimes it's the only thing you hear when the radio goes quiet and the city is asleep. I still remember that night like it just happened. It was cold, the kind of cold that gets into your bones and doesn't leave even after you go back inside. The streets were wet from a light rain that had been falling off and on all day, and the air smelled like asphalt and smoke. I was working a double shift, running patrol through the industrial side of town. It was the type of area most people avoided. Abandoned factories, old warehouses, broken streetlights that flickered for a few seconds and went dark again. It was close to 3 a.m. when dispatch called. A 911 hang-up from a payphone outside an old storage yard near the river. We didn't get a lot of those anymore. Payphones were almost gone, and the few that were still working were mostly used by people who didn't want to be traced. I was only about 10 minutes away, so I told dispatch I'd check it out. The rain had stopped by the time I got there. The lot was quiet. The chain link fence was sagging in places, and the payphone was right next to the entrance gate. I parked the cruiser, left the engine running, and stepped out. The smell of the river was strong. Mud, oil, something rotten mixed in. I checked the phone booth first. The receiver was hanging by its cord, still swaying slightly, like someone had just dropped it and left. The wet pavement beneath it had a few footprints, small ones, maybe from a man, and they led through the open gate toward the storage yard. The yard was big. Rows and rows of old metal shipping containers, some stacked too high, others rusting into the dirt. There were weeds growing through cracks in the concrete, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear water dripping steadily off a roof. I drew my flashlight and followed the prints. They were faint, but they moved deeper into the yard, between two rows of containers. The air inside the lot felt colder, the kind of cold that didn't make sense for that time of night. My boots crunched over bits of gravel and broken glass. Every time I moved the flashlight, the light bounced off the metal walls, making the shadows shift and stretch. I couldn't hear anything except the sound of my own steps and the faint hum from the cruiser idling behind me. About 50 yards in, I noticed something strange. One of the container doors was cracked open. Not wide, just enough for someone to slip through. The lock was broken and hanging loose. I stopped there for a second, just listening. The silence had a weight to it. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges letting out a long, sharp groan. Inside, it was dark and smelled like rust and damp wood. My flashlight beam cut through the shadows, showing a few old crates and some blankets piled in the corner. Someone had been living there. There were food wrappers, a half-empty bottle of water, and a small candle burned down to nothing. I looked closer and saw a bloodstain on the floor. Not a lot, but fresh enough to still look red. That's when I felt it, the sense that I wasn't alone. It's hard to explain, but after years on the job, you start to feel when something's wrong, when someone's near even if you can't see them. I moved the flashlight slowly across the inside of the container, checking every corner. Nothing, but the air felt off like someone had just been there seconds before. I backed out and started checking the next few containers. Most were empty. Some had old furniture or construction material inside. Others just piles of junk. Then I came across one with a door that had been forced open. The padlock was snapped clean, and there were fresh scrape marks in the dirt, like something heavy had been dragged out recently. The more I looked, the more I felt something wasn't right. The entire place was too quiet. Even the dripping sound had stopped. Then, from somewhere deeper in the yard, I heard a faint metallic clang. It echoed between the containers. I turned toward the sound and followed it, moving slow, scanning every direction. The footprints reappeared a few rows over, muddy, smeared, and leading to another open container. My heart was beating harder now, my hands tight around the flashlight. I followed the prints and stopped at the entrance. The smell coming from inside was stronger now, that same mix of rust and something organic, like blood that had been left out too long. I stepped inside. The light hit the far wall, and I saw it immediately. There was a tarp on the floor, and beneath it, something large. I moved closer, keeping the beam steady. The tarp was damp and stained dark in several places. When I pulled it back just a little, I saw what I had been dreading. It was a man, maybe in his late 30s. His clothes were torn, and his skin was pale. There were marks around his neck, bruises on his arms, and a large cut near his shoulder. I stepped back, trying to stay calm, and called it in. My radio cracked through the silence, the sound loud in the still air. I gave the location, requested backup, and waited for a response. The second I finished talking, I heard something behind me, a faint sound like shoes scuffing against concrete. I turned fast, the flashlight slicing through the dark. Nothing there. The sound had come from the row behind me, maybe 20 feet away. I moved toward it, careful with every step. When I rounded the corner, I saw movement, a shadow darting behind another container. I raised my light and caught a glimpse of a man, thin, wearing a torn jacket, his face pale under the beam. He turned and ran. I started after him, the sound of my boots slapping against the wet ground echoing between the metal walls. The guy was fast. He cut between containers, heading toward the back of the yard where the fence met the river. My flashlight bounced off the rusted surfaces as I tried to keep him in sight. He slipped once, his foot catching on a broken pallet, but he kept going. I shouted for him to stop, but he didn't look back. When I reached the back fence, I saw that it had a section cut open near the bottom. The wire was pulled apart just enough for someone to crawl through. I ducked down and followed, my jacket snagging on the metal as I squeezed through. The other side dropped down to the riverbank. The mud was soft, and the sound of water rushing against the rocks filled the air. I could see his tracks in the mud, fresh, uneven, leading toward a small cluster of trees near the waterline. I followed them, flashlight cutting through the fog that hung low over the ground. I found him about 50 yards down, collapsed near the edge of the water. He was on his knees, hunched over, breathing hard. I could see the blood on his hands. He looked exhausted, like he had been running for a long time before I even got there. When I reached him, he tried to crawl forward but didn't get far. There was a deep wound across his side, and it looked old, half-healed, and torn open again. He didn't make a sound, just kept trying to pull himself toward the water until he couldn't anymore. By the time backup arrived, it was over. He was gone. Paramedics confirmed it. We searched the area and found more evidence hidden near the trees: bags, clothing, and a small shovel. It didn't take long to piece it together. The man had been squatting in that storage yard for months, moving between containers, living off scraps. But there was more. In the containers, detectives found several other tarps, all with traces of blood. Some had tools, ropes, and knives. He had been attacking people who wandered through that area. Mostly drifters, addicts, people nobody would notice missing for weeks. The man we found by the river was one of his own victims, the last one. Somehow, he survived the initial attack and fought back. The killer must have gone after him again, but it turned on him. Both men ended up dying there, just a few hundred feet apart. For weeks after, the yard stayed taped off. The containers were sealed, the evidence processed, and the place was scheduled for demolition. But every time I drove past it after that, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had been to both of them that night. How I'd walked through that maze of metal and darkness while two men, one dying, one trying to finish what he started, had been there somewhere in the same cold, wet silence. It wasn't the first time I'd seen death on the job, and it wouldn't be the last, but that night stayed with me because of the way it felt. Not because of the violence or the sight of it, but because of the quiet that followed after. The kind of quiet that doesn't belong to a place where people live. The kind that belongs to somewhere forgotten, where nobody was ever supposed to be. Sometimes, when I think about it, I can still see the payphone swaying gently in the dark, the receiver clicking softly against the metal. Someone had made that call. Maybe the victim, maybe the killer. I'll never know for sure. All I know is that by the time I got there, the only thing left was the echo of that call, the cold air, and the sound of the river carrying it all away. It was a Wednesday night, just after midnight, and I was sitting in my cruiser in the back lot of a gas station, finishing my report on a traffic stop from earlier. The town was quiet as usual. Most of the lights along Main Street had already gone dark except for the ones in front of the 24-hour diner and a single car wash across the road. The kind of stillness that sits heavy, like the whole town is holding its breath. Nights like that always made me uneasy because I knew something would eventually break the silence. It always did. The call came through around 12:47 a.m. Dispatch said there was a 911 hang-up from a rural address just outside town, near the old gravel plant. The line had stayed open for about 6 seconds before cutting off. The location was listed under a man named David Lang, but when dispatch tried to call back, the number went straight to voicemail. Calls like that weren't uncommon. Most ended up being accidental dials or drunk arguments that fizzled out before we arrived. Still, the address was isolated and it was my sector, so I took it. The road to the property ran parallel to the river and curved through farmland and woods for a few miles before hitting the gravel yard. The fog was rolling in thick, the kind that cut visibility down to a few car lengths. My headlights caught the shapes of trees, fence posts, and the occasional mailbox before fading back into white nothing. The road was slick, and I kept my speed low, radio crackling quietly beside me. After about 10 minutes, I saw the turnoff. The gravel crunch under my tires was the only sound for a while. The driveway stretched for what felt like half a mile before ending at a cluster of small buildings. An old house, a detached garage, and a large workshop with sheet metal siding. The porch light was off, and there were no cars visible outside. The only light came from the faint glow leaking through a crack in the garage door. I parked a few yards from the main house, killed the engine, and stepped out. The air was cold and smelled like wet dirt and metal. I listened for any movement but heard nothing. No dogs barking, no footsteps, no voices. Just the slow drip of water coming from somewhere behind the house. I started toward the garage first since it was the only building showing any sign of activity. The gravel crunched loud under my boots, and I kept my flashlight low, the beam sliding over the ground and catching little details. Muddy boot prints, tire marks, and something else I noticed near the edge of the concrete slab. It looked like a smudge of dark liquid, maybe oil, but the color didn't seem right. It was too red. When I got to the door, I could hear a faint hum inside, something mechanical, like a small generator or tool running. I pushed the door up slowly. The metal rattled against the rails, and the noise inside stopped immediately. The hum died. My flashlight swept across the interior, and the first thing I saw was a workbench covered in tools and wires. There were power cords running across the floor, a large plastic tarp draped over something in the center of the room, and an overturned stool lying nearby. The air inside was damp, and the smell hit me right away, metallic and sour, like blood and oil mixed together. My stomach tightened. I moved closer, careful with my footing. I pulled the tarp back, and that's when I froze. Underneath was a man lying flat on his back, his shirt soaked through with blood. His eyes were open, but his body was completely still. I recognized his face from the property records. It was David Lang, the homeowner. His left hand was wrapped in a torn piece of cloth, and there was a knife lying next to him. The blood on the blade had dried. There were marks on his wrists, deep ones like he had been tied up recently. I backed up, radioed for backup and medical, then stepped toward the doorway to check for anyone else. That's when I saw another set of footprints. Smaller, lighter, heading away from the garage toward the tree line behind the house. They were fresh, pressed deep into the mud, and still glistening under the beam of my light. I followed them slowly, scanning both sides as I moved. The ground was uneven, and the fog had thickened enough that the trees looked like shadows standing in front of shadows. The footprints led about 30 yards into the woods before stopping near a small clearing. There, I found something that made my skin crawl. A sleeping bag, half unzipped, with clothes scattered around it. Muddy jeans, a torn jacket, and a backpack dumped on its side. There were food wrappers, a flashlight with dead batteries, and a small hunting knife sticking out of the dirt. Someone had been living there, probably for a while. I circled the area, looking for movement, and that's when I saw a faint light flicker through the trees to my right. It was small, weak, like the glow of a phone screen. I moved toward it, keeping my steps slow and steady, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. When I reached the edge of the next clearing, I found a man lying on the ground, face down, half covered by leaves. His clothes were filthy, and his hands were bound behind his back with duct tape. He wasn't moving, but I could see his breath in the cold air. I approached carefully, checked for weapons, then rolled him over. His face was bruised and cut, and there were marks around his neck. He looked terrified even though he was unconscious. I secured him and called for medics again, reporting a second injured person. I could hear sirens faintly in the distance by then, still several minutes away. While waiting, I checked his pockets. There was a small notebook and a wallet with no ID, just a few folded bills and a faded photo of a young woman and a kid. The notebook had pages full of scribbled notes, lists of tools, dates, and what looked like names. The top page had a single line that read, "He doesn't let me leave. When the paramedics arrived, They confirmed what I already knew. David Lang was dead. The second man was still alive but barely conscious. He was taken to the hospital. The rest of the property was searched by the other units that came later, and what they found filled in the rest of the story piece by piece. The man in the woods was a drifter, someone who had been picked up months earlier to help with odd jobs around the property. He'd been working for Lang, doing cleanup and repair work for cash. But for reasons nobody could fully explain, Lang had started keeping him there. Isolated, watched, not allowed to leave. The notes we found showed that the man had tried to escape twice. The last attempt had turned violent. Lang had tied him up again, but at some point, the man broke free and turned the knife on him. The 911 call came from the garage phone. The drifter must have tried to call for help after the fight, but passed out before finishing the call. He had been living in that tent near the woods ever since Lang started controlling him. When I wrote the report later, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my head. The dead man under the tarp, the smell of metal and blood, the silence that filled that garage when the hum stopped. I kept thinking about how close I had been to finding both of them while one was still alive and the other was dying just feet away. It's been years since that night, but I still think about that property. It's empty now, overgrown with weeds and brush. The building's falling apart more each season. The garage roof has caved in, and the county keeps talking about tearing it down, but nobody's done it yet. Every time I drive by on patrol, I slow down without meaning to. The driveway looks the same, wet gravel, tire tracks half faded by rain. I think about how quiet that place was, how the fog swallowed everything, how the only thing moving was that hanging light inside the garage. That kind of silence doesn't just fade, it stays. It sticks to places like that, places that saw something bad and never got washed clean again. That night reminded me that sometimes evil isn't loud or dramatic. It's quiet. It hides behind locked doors and looks like an ordinary house from the road. And sometimes it doesn't end with a chase or a shootout. It ends with you standing in a dark room, staring at a body on the floor and realizing you're too late to stop what already happened. That was the night I learned how silence can be the loudest thing you'll ever hear. It was a cold October night, one of those nights where the air feels heavy and damp, and the only sound you hear on patrol is the hum of your own engine. I'd been working the night shift for almost 7 years, and by that point, the silence didn't bother me much anymore. But there are some nights that feel different for reasons you can't explain. That night was one of them. The sky was low with clouds, the roads were slick from earlier rain, and everything smelled like wet asphalt and pine. The kind of night where headlights cut through the dark like knives. I was assigned to the outer edge of town, a stretch of back roads that wound through farmland and a few industrial lots that never seemed to close. It was around 1:30 a.m. when dispatch radioed me about an abandoned vehicle reported off County Road 14. The caller was a truck driver who said he saw a car pulled halfway into a drainage ditch with its hazard lights on. No one was around. He kept driving but called it in about 10 minutes later when it still hadn't moved. Usually, that kind of call turns out to be nothing. A drunk driver who wandered off, someone who ran out of gas, or an old car that just died. Still, procedure was procedure, so I turned off the main road and started toward it. The area was rural, with nothing but trees, power lines, and open fields on both sides. My spotlight picked up patches of mist drifting over the road. About 5 minutes later, I saw the faint flash of hazards through the fog. A silver sedan sat crooked in the ditch, its rear tires still on the shoulder, the front end sunk into soft mud. The driver's door was open, swinging slightly each time the wind pushed against it. The engine wasn't running, but the headlights were still on. I parked behind it, flipped my lights on, and stepped out. The air was colder than before. I could see my breath, and the only sounds were the ticking of the car's cooling engine and water dripping somewhere nearby. I scanned the ground with my flashlight. There were shoe prints leading away from the driver's door toward the field beyond the ditch, barely visible in the mud. The prints weren't deep, so it hadn't rained since whoever left them walked away. Inside the car, the keys were still in the ignition. A phone sat face down in the passenger seat, screen cracked, and a half-empty bottle of water lay near the console. There was a jacket thrown into the back seat, and the glove box was open with papers scattered on the floor. It didn't look like a robbery, just abandoned in a hurry. I followed the footprints through the ditch and into the field. The ground was soft and uneven, and my boots sank with every step. The beam of my light cut through the fog, revealing rows of old, dead corn stalks that hadn't been harvested properly. The tracks continued between them for a while, then veered toward a line of trees at the back of the property. The fog swallowed most of my view, and I couldn't hear anything but my own breathing and the faint rustle of dry stalks brushing against my jacket. About 50 yards in, I found something lying on the ground, a wallet. It was damp, covered in mud, but the ID inside was still readable. The name was Jacob White, age 27. Local address just a few miles from town. I put it in my pocket and kept moving toward the tree line. The further I went, the softer the ground became, turning into a patch of swampy mud near the edge of the woods. That's where I saw it. A set of drag marks, faint but visible in the mud, leading deeper into the trees. They weren't from an animal. They were straight, deliberate, like something heavy had been pulled. I followed them for maybe another 20 yards until I came to a small clearing. There was an old shack there, almost hidden by trees and overgrowth. The boards were gray and warped, the door hanging by a single hinge. I could tell it hadn't been lived in for years. Still, I saw light flickering faintly through the cracks in the wall, like a candle or a lantern. The first thing that hit me when I stepped inside was the smell. It was thick and sour, like rot mixed with metal and old earth. My flashlight beam caught dust floating in the air and an overturned chair in the corner. The floor was covered in old tools, rags, and empty cans. I took a few steps in, and the boards creaked under my boots. That's when I saw something on the far side of the room, something slumped against the wall. It was a man. His shirt was soaked dark down the front, and his head hung low. There was no movement, no sound. The skin on his hands was pale, and the dirt around him was stained almost black. I checked for a pulse, but there was nothing. The wallet ID matched the face. It was Jacob White. There was no sign of a weapon, no defensive wounds, just the one deep gash running across his abdomen. It looked deliberate, clean. Whoever did it had experience or didn't hesitate. What made it worse was that I couldn't find a single sign of a struggle. No overturned furniture near him, no blood trail leading in or out. It looked like he'd been placed there. I checked the rest of the shack and found more signs that someone had been there recently. Fresh footprints in the dirt, a still-burning candle, and a trail of muddy boot prints that led out the back door. I followed them for several yards until they disappeared into a patch of tall grass. Backup arrived about 15 minutes later. By then, the fog had thickened to the point where the flashlights barely reached more than 10 feet ahead. We combed the woods, but the tracks were gone. We searched for hours, fields, creek beds, side roads, but whoever had been there vanished without a trace. In the following days, the investigation dug up pieces that didn't make much sense. Jacob's car hadn't been reported stolen. He had no criminal record, no known enemies, no signs of debt or trouble. His phone was examined, but the last call was to a gas station number hours before his death. They found no messages, no strange contacts, nothing that hinted at who he met that night or why he left his car running. There was one strange thing, though: DNA on the handle of the car door. It matched to an ex-con named Travis Holt, who'd served time years earlier for assault. He'd been released 2 months before the incident and had no known address. We put out alerts, checked shelters, old addresses, and even combed through surveillance footage around town. Nothing. It was like he vanished into the air after that night. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the image of that shack. The smell, the silence, the way the candle kept burning even though the air inside was so damp and cold. I went back to the scene a few times after the case went cold, just to make sure no one else had been using the place. Each time, it felt emptier, like the woods had swallowed it a little more. The boards sagged, the air grew stiller, and eventually the county tore it down. Even after it was gone, I kept thinking about the distance between the car and the shack. How Jacob had walked all that way barefoot through mud and fog. Why he didn't run back to the road when he had the chance. Maybe he didn't know where he was going. Maybe someone led him. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as blood loss. Time of death was estimated around 1:15 a.m., the same time the truck driver saw the car sitting on the road. That meant Jacob was already dead when I got the call. Less than 20 minutes. That thought stuck with me longer than I'd like to admit. It's been years since that case, but I still think about it during night shifts, especially when I'm driving the outer roads alone and the fog starts to roll in. I've seen a lot of things working this job, accidents, suicides, murders, but something about that one stayed with me. Not because of the violence, but because of the silence around it. No screams, no witnesses, just a car, a trail of footprints, and a dead man in an old shack. Everything in between disappeared. Every now and then, a rookie will ask about unsolved calls, and that's the story I tell them. Not because it's the worst one, but because it's the one that reminds me how fast things can go wrong without anyone noticing. How quiet danger can be when it's patient. Sometimes, when I drive that stretch of road and see the fog hanging low over the fields, I slow down at the old ditch out of habit. The weeds have grown over most of it now, and there's nothing left to show what happened there. But every time I stop, I still find myself staring into that field, trying to picture the footprints, trying to figure out why Jacob White walked into the woods that night and never walked back out. That's the thing about police work. The ones that stay with you aren't the ones you solved. They're the ones that never gave you an ending, just a question that follows you around in the dark, waiting for an answer that never comes. It was close to midnight when I got the call. I had just parked behind the station to write up a report when dispatch radioed about a possible abandoned building disturbance on the edge of town. The caller was a night security guard from a trucking lot nearby. He said he kept hearing banging and movement coming from an old warehouse across the road, a place that hadn't been used for years. He checked once himself but didn't go inside after seeing the front door hanging open. He thought maybe some kids or squatters had broken in. I didn't think much of it. Calls like that came in all the time, usually just homeless people trying to stay warm or teenagers looking for a place to drink. The warehouse was known around town. It used to belong to a freight company that shut down in the early 2000s after a fire. Nobody ever tore it down. It sat there with its broken windows, rusted doors, and half the roof missing. People said it was full of rats and oil drums, nothing else. Took me about 10 minutes to get there. The streets were quiet, and fog was starting to roll in from the river. The air smelled like rain and old exhaust. The building came into view, sitting behind a chain-link fence that leaned to one side. The main gate was open, one of the hinges broken clean off. I pulled in slow, headlights sweeping across the cracked pavement and weeds that had grown tall through the asphalt. I parked with my lights facing the main entrance and stepped out. The wind was low, but every sound seemed to carry. The hum of the engine cooling, the crunch of gravel under my boots, the faint buzz of a broken streetlight flickering near the lot. The front door of the warehouse was open just like the caller said. The lock busted clean. I could see nothing but black inside. I turned on my flashlight and walked in. The beam cut through layers of dust in the air, showing bits of debris and metal parts scattered across the floor. The smell hit me right away. Wetwood, rust, and something faintly chemical. The sound of dripping water echoed through the space, like it was leaking from somewhere up high. The building was huge. Long rows of empty loading bays on one side and a set of rusted stairs leading up to an old office on the other. My boots left prints in the thick layer of dust as I moved deeper inside. There were old tire tracks on the concrete floor, but they were faded, probably years old. Halfway down one of the aisles, I found a pile of blankets and cardboard stacked against a wall. Someone had definitely been staying there. There were empty cans, a burned candle, and a plastic bottle half full of water. It looked recent. The candle wax was still soft. I kept sweeping my light across the walls, moving toward the back where the dark seemed heavier. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. I could feel the damp chill coming off the concrete, and it made my jacket stick to my skin. There was a faint smell of smoke, maybe from someone cooking or burning trash. Then I saw something odd on the ground near one of the far corners. At first, I thought it was just trash, but as I got closer, I realized it was a shoe. A single brown work boot, muddy and worn. About 5 feet away was another one, and between them, a dark smear that stretched across the floor and disappeared under a pile of scrap metal. I felt my stomach tighten. The smear wasn't oil, it was too dark and thick, and it trailed off unevenly. I followed it slowly, stepping around the debris, until I reached the other side of the pile. That's when I saw the rest of it. It was a man. He was lying on his side, face toward the wall, arms twisted awkwardly under him. His clothes were filthy, torn in a few places, and his back was soaked through with what was obviously blood. He looked like he'd been dead for a while, but not long enough to decompose. Maybe a few days. The floor around him was stained dark, and flies had already started gathering. I backed up and scanned the ground. There were footprints in the dust, fresh ones. Not mine. I could see where someone had walked around him recently, circling, almost pacing. The prints led toward the far exit door on the other side of the warehouse. I followed them, moving slower now, careful not to make too much noise. The flashlight beam shook a little in my hand. The door at the back was cracked open just enough for air to move through. A thin draft blew in, carrying the smell of damp grass and something metallic. Outside, I could hear faint movement, like someone shifting their weight or stepping on gravel. I turned off my light for a second and waited. The dark felt heavier than before, like the whole place was holding its breath. I could hear the faint drip from a broken pipe somewhere behind me and the low creak of the door in the wind. After a few moments, the sound outside stopped. When I turned my light back on and pushed the door open, the night air hit me, cold and wet. My light caught the edge of tire tracks in the mud leading away from the door, fresh enough that the edges hadn't filled with water yet. They went straight toward the tree line behind the property. I radioed it in for backup and kept my eyes on the tracks. While waiting, I followed them just far enough to see that they ended at a dirt trail that ran behind a row of old shipping containers. There was nothing else there. No movement, no sound, just the faint smell of exhaust hanging in the air. Whoever had been there had just left. When the other units arrived, we swept the whole area. They brought dogs, lights, everything. We found nothing but the same muddy tire tracks and the dead man inside. His pockets were empty. No ID, no wallet, no phone. Nothing that said who he was or why he was there. The investigation dragged on for weeks. The fingerprints came back with no match. Dental records took longer but led nowhere. The autopsy confirmed he'd been stabbed twice in the lower back and left to bleed out. No defensive wounds, no sign of a struggle. The medical examiner said he probably didn't even see it coming. The only real clue we found was a partial boot print near the loading dock outside. A heavy tread pattern, size 12, possibly from a work boot. It matched the type used by employees at one of the nearby truck yards. That made sense since the caller who reported the noise worked across the street. We interviewed the workers, checked cameras, even reviewed vehicle logs from the night of the call. Nothing matched. Every driver accounted for, every shift logged. It was as if someone just appeared in that warehouse, did what they came to do, and vanished. About 2 weeks after the case went cold, I drove past the warehouse again during my shift. The county had boarded it up by then, but the boards were already starting to peel from the damp air. I parked for a minute, lights off, and just looked at it. The place felt wrong now, heavier than it did before. It wasn't fear exactly, it was something else, a kind of unease that you can't explain. I kept thinking about those tire tracks. They stopped halfway down the trail and then disappeared, like the driver had turned off into the woods. But we never found the vehicle. I went back once on my own during daylight just to see. I followed that same trail into the trees, and about 50 yards in, I found a burned patch of dirt, ash, melted metal, small shards of glass. Looked like a fire had been built there recently. I bagged a few samples and sent them in, but they didn't turn up anything useful. Over time, other cases came and went, but that one stuck. Maybe because it was so simple, one man, one empty warehouse, one unknown killer, and yet there was no reason behind it. No robbery, no revenge, no personal tie. Just violence for no clear cause. It's been years since then, and the warehouse is gone now. They finally tore it down and paved the lot for new development. Every time I drive by, I remember standing in that dark building, the smell of rust and blood in the air, the silence pressing in from all sides. What unsettles me most isn't the body or the crime scene. It's the sense that whoever did it probably drove past me that same night. Maybe they saw my cruiser lights before they left. Maybe they were still close by when I walked through the door, watching from the fog or sitting in their truck with the engine off. That's the part that stays. You tell yourself you're used to danger in this job, that you can handle the things you see. But it's not the violence that eats at you, it's the not knowing. The gaps between what you find and what's missing. I still keep a photo of the case file in my desk, just a single picture of the warehouse interior before they tore it down. You can't see much in it, just the corner where the man was lying, a pool of dried blood, and a long shadow from my flashlight cutting across the floor. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I think about the sound I heard outside that door that night, the faint crunch of gravel, like someone stepping just far enough away to stay unseen. Whoever it was, they were close, closer than I realized. And that's the thing about this job. The danger isn't always what you find. It's what you miss, what's standing just outside your light, waiting for you to turn around. It was around 2 in the morning when I got the call. I'd been parked near the highway, finishing up paperwork, trying to keep myself awake on another long night shift. The radio cracked through the silence, the dispatcher's voice calm as always, reporting a possible 10 to 54. An abandoned vehicle, off a service road near the old quarry. It wasn't far from where I was sitting, maybe 5 or 6 miles out. No other units were nearby, so I took it. The quarry road wasn't a place people usually went at that hour. It was an old access route mostly used by dump trucks and heavy machinery during the day. At night, it was pitch black, unlit, and lined with thick pine trees. I'd patrolled it a few times before. Quiet, empty, and unsettlingly still. The kind of place where headlights barely make a dent in the darkness. As I turned off the main highway, the air seemed to change. It always did on those back roads, colder, heavier, as if the night was thicker there. The asphalt turned to gravel, and the crunch under my tires echoed off the trees. My headlights caught dust rising in front of me, and I slowed down when I saw a glint ahead. Car pulled over on the right side of the road. It was an older model sedan, maybe 10 years old, covered in mud. The driver's door was wide open, the hazard lights blinking weakly. The engine wasn't running, but the keys were still in the ignition. I parked a few feet behind it and got out. The night air hit me hard, cold enough that my breath came out in visible clouds. I walked around the car slowly, checking everything. The front tires were half off the road, sunk into soft dirt. There was no one inside. The driver's seat was pushed back, and the interior looked messy but not ransacked. A coffee cup was spilled near the cup holder, and a cell phone sat face down on the passenger seat. Its screen was cracked, and the back was muddy, like someone had dropped it outside and tossed it back in. I aimed my flashlight toward the ditch. The ground there was uneven and damp, covered in dead leaves and gravel. That's when I noticed footprints, barely visible but definitely there, leading away from the car and down the embankment toward the quarry path. There were 2 sets, one from regular shoes, one that looked heavier, like work boots. The spacing suggested whoever it was had been walking fast. I radioed in my location, let dispatch know I'd be checking it out. The quarry itself was about a half-mile down that dirt path. I followed the prints slowly, keeping my light low. The trees on both sides grew tighter the farther I went, and the sound of the gravel under my boots was the only thing I could hear. Every so often I'd stop and listen, but the woods were silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. About 5 minutes in, the smell hit me. It was faint at first, then stronger the closer I got to the clearing ahead. It wasn't something you mistake. It was the thick, metallic, almost sweet smell of blood. My pace slowed. The path opened up, and I could see the quarry basin below. A wide pit surrounded by piles of broken rock and rusted machinery. Moonlight reflected off puddles left from earlier rain. At the edge of the pit, I saw something lying near the rocks. It looked like clothing at first, but as I got closer, my flashlight caught it clearly. It was a man, lying face down in the dirt. His arms were bent awkwardly, and his shirt was soaked through with dark stains. I checked for a pulse, but there was nothing. He was cold. The injuries were bad, multiple stab wounds, deep, clean, deliberate. Whoever did it hadn't hesitated. I scanned the area. The second set of footprints continued a few feet past the body, then disappeared near a slope that led toward the lower quarry floor. I followed them down slowly, shining my light ahead, careful where I stepped. The ground was slippery, and small stones rolled under my boots as I moved. At the bottom, the air felt different, heavier, almost still. There were tire tracks here too, fresh enough to still have shape in the mud. They led to an old maintenance shed near the edge of the pit. The building looked half collapsed, its roof bent inward, the metal door hanging by a single hinge. The tracks stopped right in front of it. I moved closer, scanning the ground. There were more footprints, 3 or 4 different kinds now. Someone had been there recently, maybe within the last hour. The door creaked slightly when the wind hit it, but inside, it was pitch black. I stepped in, and the smell hit me again, worse this time. Metallic, mixed with rot and oil. My flashlight caught something on the ground. Bags torn open, with old clothes and tools scattered everywhere. In the corner, there were dark stains across the concrete, smeared and dried. It wasn't just one incident. It looked like this place had been used before. I checked every corner, every crate, but found nothing alive. No movement, no sound. Only the distant drip of water from the ceiling and the wind pushing through the broken metal walls. I took photos, marked the location, then went back out toward the body. By the time backup arrived, the fog had rolled in so thick that you could barely see the cruiser lights. We secured the scene, collected samples, and followed the tracks that led out of the quarry. They went on for almost a mile before merging with a set of tire ruts heading toward the highway. The tread pattern didn't match the sedan we found. It was from a truck. When daylight came, the whole area looked even worse. The fog had lifted, revealing how isolated that quarry really was. The nearest houses were miles away. You could scream your lungs out there, and no one would ever hear you. Over the next few days, the investigation unfolded piece by piece. The dead man was identified as a local mechanic who'd been reported missing 2 days earlier. The car belonged to him. He had no criminal record, no known enemies, nothing suspicious in his life. Just a regular man who worked long hours and lived alone. Forensics found traces of blood from another person in the shed, along with a small piece of rubber from a work boot sole. That gave us something to work with. The pattern was distinct, a brand used mostly by construction workers. We ran it against recent purchases from local stores, and one name popped up that fit too easily. A contractor who'd been working a site just a few miles from the quarry. When we went to check his place, he was gone. His truck was missing, the house half empty, and his phone left behind on the counter. A neighbor said they saw him leave late the same night the call came in. He hadn't been seen since. The trail went cold after that. No credit card use, no sightings, no trace of his truck. Just gone. For a long time, I couldn't shake the memory of that night. The silence of that quarry, the fog sitting over the rocks like a blanket, and the way the footprints told a story that stopped halfway. I started thinking about how close I might have been to whoever did it. The tracks were fresh. The tire marks were fresh. If I'd gotten there even 10 minutes earlier, maybe I'd have seen headlights pulling away through the trees. Months passed, and the case sat open, but nothing new came in. The shed was eventually torn down when the quarry was repurposed for landfill use. All that remained was the slope, the rocks, and a few rusted pieces of metal sticking out of the ground. But it never left my mind. I'd find myself driving that same stretch of road sometimes, just out of habit. Every time, I'd slow down near the turnoff where we'd found the car. The ditch there filled with water after storms, and the weeds had grown high enough to hide anything smaller than a truck. It looked ordinary in daylight, but at night it still carried that same stillness. The kind of silence that presses against you, that makes you feel like something's watching even when there's nothing there. After a while, I realized what bothered me most wasn't the crime itself. It was the timing. The quarry was abandoned for years. No one ever went there. No traffic, no workers, no witnesses. Whoever chose that spot knew it. Knew that even if something happened, it would take hours before anyone noticed. I started thinking about that second pair of footprints, the heavier ones. They weren't just following the victim. They led the way. Whoever it was, they brought him there. Maybe by threat, maybe by force, but they knew exactly where to go. And the thing that stayed with me, the part that gnawed at me every time I thought about it, was that I might have driven past that truck while heading there. The fog was so thick that night, I could barely see 10 feet ahead. A pair of headlights could have been parked anywhere along that road, engine off, driver watching as I passed. That thought sat with me long after the case closed. The idea that sometimes you arrive just late enough to find what's left behind, while the person responsible is already fading into the dark. Years later, I still drive that route from time to time, out of habit more than anything. There's nothing there now, just an overgrown dirt path and a locked gate where the quarry used to be. But every time I slow down near it, I can still picture that car, hazards blinking, driver's door open, and the line of footprints leading away into the dark. And I always think about how close I might have been that night. How maybe, somewhere in the fog, the man who did it was standing still, just far enough away to watch me find what he left behind. I had been working as a dispatcher long enough to know that most 911 calls had a certain rhythm to them. People panic, people shout, people cry, but usually you can make sense of what's happening. You learn to recognize the difference between a true emergency and someone who dialed by mistake. That night, though, the call that came through didn't fit into any category I'd come to expect. It still sticks with me because I know how close it came to slipping through the cracks. The phone rang and I picked it up like every other call, but what came through wasn't a scream or a clear sentence. It was a whisper, low, shaky, almost drowned out by the background noise. At first I thought it was a child or maybe a prank, but then I caught the tone. It was fear. I pressed my headset tighter, straining to catch anything. Words came through broken, like the caller was covering the phone or pressing it to her chest. I could barely understand her, but after a few repeats, I managed to get what sounded like an address. I typed it in quickly, sent it over to the officers on duty, and told them to head that way. All the while I kept the line open. There was no conversation, no ability to get a clear picture. Just breathing, shaky and uneven, and sometimes silence so long I thought she had dropped the phone. Every instinct in me said not to disconnect. If I stayed on, at least I could listen. At least I could keep a line open between her and help. Minutes feel like hours when you're stuck waiting. I had the map pulled up, could see the officers closing in on the location, but sitting there listening to that quiet breathing made my chest feel heavy. It wasn't just another call. I knew she was hiding. I knew someone was close by, close enough to make her afraid to speak. When the officers arrived, I relayed everything I had. Whispering female, address confirmed, no clear details. They pulled up to the house, and before they even got to the door, a man stepped outside. I couldn't hear what was said, but they later told me he was calm, almost too calm. He explained that someone must have dialed 911 by accident, that there was no emergency. He stuck to it like it was rehearsed. On the radio, the officers' voices stayed professional, steady, but I could tell they didn't like it. They knew a whispering 911 call wasn't something you brushed off. They stayed outside with him, talking, drawing it out, giving themselves time to read the situation. Meanwhile, I sat in the comm center, my headset still open to the call. She hadn't hung up. The silence pressed on, broken only by those faint breaths. Then it happened. One of the officers reported seeing something, a movement at the side of the house. He didn't say it at first, but later I learned he caught a glimpse of a tiny hand. Just fingers at first, poking out from a cracked window, fluttering like someone too weak to wave. That was all it took. They pushed past the male and went inside. The silence on my headset finally broke with muffled sounds of motion. Doors opening, boots on flooring, raised voices in the background. My heart was hammering as I kept listening, not daring to take the line down. Inside the house, they found her. A woman, beaten badly, bruises on her face and arms, clearly terrified. She had been kept there, hidden away with no way out. The only chance she had was the whispering call she managed to make and the small movement of her hand through the window. The officers took the male into custody on the spot, charging him with forcible confinement and assault. The woman was taken out carefully, slowly, almost carried, and given medical care right away. The whole time, the 911 line stayed open in my headset, silent now except for the faint background noise of radios and movement. When I finally disconnected, I sat there for a long minute staring at the empty call log on my screen. My ears still rang with the sound of her breathing, the faint scratch of a whisper I couldn't understand. It shook me in a way most calls never did. I'd handled fatal crashes, domestic fights, even situations where people didn't make it before officers got there. But this one lingered because of how close it came to slipping away. If I hadn't strained to hear that address, if I had dismissed the call as a prank, if the officers hadn't noticed that tiny hand at the window, the outcome would have been different. The scariest part wasn't the violence inside that house, though that was bad enough. It was the fragility of the whole thing. One faint whisper, one trembling hand, and the entire case hinged on someone paying attention. The woman couldn't shout for help. She couldn't run. All she had was the thin thread of that 911 call and the hope that someone on the other end would take her seriously. I think about that night often, how still it was in the comm center, how quiet her breathing sounded, how close it felt to losing her in that silence. It reminds me every time that behind the static, behind the chaos of calls and codes, there are people clinging to their last chance. The officers saved her life that night, but I'll never forget what it felt like to sit in that chair, headset on, listening to a whisper that almost got swallowed by the quiet. It made my hair stand up then, and it still does now because I know exactly how close she came to never being found. And I know exactly how thin the line was between her survival and another story that ended too soon. When you've worked enough years in law enforcement, you learn one thing very quickly. There's no such thing as an accidental 911 call. Phones don't just dial emergency services by mistake, and even if they do, there's usually something behind it. Someone misdials in a panic, a kid picks up the phone because something feels wrong at home, or a victim tries to call but can't bring themselves to speak. Either way, if dispatch gives you an address where someone dialed 911, you treat it as real until you can prove otherwise. That mindset came into play one night on patrol. The call came in late in the evening. Dispatch advised us that a 911 call had been received from a residence. The line had gone dead almost immediately. No words, no background noise, nothing. Just silence before the hang-up. When dispatch tried to call back, no one answered. I was close by, so I was the first to pull up. My partner was only a few minutes out. From the street, the house looked ordinary. Small, single-story, light glowing in one window. No yelling, no visible struggle. Everything seemed calm, which in my experience can be more unsettling than hearing screams. Calm can be the mask that hides something worse. I parked and walked up the path. Before I even knocked, the front door opened. A man stepped out, casual as could be, like he had nothing to hide. He asked what was going on. I explained about the 911 call, and without missing a beat, he told me it must have been an accidental dial. He laughed it off lightly, shrugging his shoulders like it was nothing. Right then, a wave of unease hit me. People who are genuinely innocent usually look confused or concerned when the police show up at their door. They'll say they didn't call, maybe invite you in just to show everything's fine. This man's reaction was too smooth, too quick. He didn't even seem surprised that we were standing there. That's when my inner alarm bells started ringing. I held my ground at the porch, scanning behind him into the dim hallway. Couldn't see much. My partner arrived just then, pulling up and walking over. We both knew without speaking something was off. We asked the man a few more questions, and he kept insisting it was an accident, nothing to worry about. His voice was steady, his body language relaxed, but his eyes kept darting slightly, like he was trying to track whether we believed him. I could feel him pushing us to leave, trying to get us off the property as fast as possible. And here's the thing, if you've been in this line of work long enough, you learn to pay attention to the gaps, the details that don't fit. Someone did call 911 from that address. Dispatch traced it directly. Phones don't lie about where the call came from. So if this guy was saying it was an accident, I needed to know whose accident it was. We lingered. I started making small observations out loud. Things like confirming the phone number on record and pointing out how 911 calls are traced. The more I spoke, the more tense he became. He didn't show it on his face, but his posture stiffened, his shoulders tighter. While I kept him engaged, my partner took a slow walk around, shining his flashlight at the windows. That's when it happened. At a side window, just for a split second, a shadow moved. Then a hand appeared, pressed against the glass, trembling. It was quick, almost hesitant, but it was enough. That was the confirmation we needed. We moved fast. I stepped past the man at the door as my partner circled to the side. Inside the house, it was dim, cluttered, the air heavy and stale. I followed the sound of muffled crying down the hall. One of the bedroom doors was locked. We forced it open. Inside was a woman. She was sitting on the floor, her face bruised, her wrists showing marks from being bound. The phone she'd used to call was lying broken beside her. The look in her eyes when she saw us was something I'll never forget. Terror mixed with desperate relief. She had risked everything to make that call. We got her out immediately, calling for medical. She could barely speak, her voice rasping from crying and whispering too long. But she was alive and she was safe. The man outside wasn't calm anymore. He was handcuffed, shouting, cursing, twisting against us. His smooth act had cracked wide open. Once the adrenaline settled and the woman was taken to the hospital, the reality of it hit me. If we had believed him, if we had just written it off as an accident, she would have been left locked in that room, beaten and terrified. She had put everything on the line to dial those 3 numbers, hoping someone would come, and it was on us to not ignore it. That night made me realize how thin the line is between failure and success in this job. It's easy to take things at face value, to believe the story someone gives you when they look calm and collected. But calm can be a mask, lies can be smooth, and the cost of believing them can be someone's life. What stuck with me wasn't the arrest, or even the sight of her injuries. It was that moment at the window when I saw her hand, just the faint press of a palm against glass, a signal that she was there, waiting, hoping not to be forgotten. If my partner hadn't been paying attention, if I hadn't felt suspicious about the man's act, we would have walked away. That thought haunted me more than anything else. There's nothing glamorous about a call like that. It doesn't end with applause or celebration. It ends with a report, evidence bags, and another case added to the pile. But for that woman, it meant freedom. It meant she survived the night. And for me, it meant I never again dismissed a 911 call as just an accident. Because there's always a reason someone dials those numbers. Always, even if they can't say a word. Even if someone else stands in the doorway trying to convince you otherwise. The memory still sends a chill through me because I know how close it came to being the other way. We could have left. She could have been forgotten. Instead, we saw through the calm mask, noticed the hand, and acted. That's the only reason she's alive. And that's a weight I'll carry every time a call comes across the radio.